When we speak about Russian cosmos, I think we should not forget that they were actually anti-cosmists, because the notion of the cosmos was actually introduced by the ancient Greek philosophy, and it means harmony and order. Something that is defined versus chaos. So cosmos versus chaos. That was a basic figure of the ancient Greek thought, also basic figure of the Platonic thought. And the goal of humans was understood to accommodate themselves to the cosmic order. So the cosmos was understood as something stable and universal, and people, humans, as in the need to inscribe themselves into the cosmic order. However, it was not the case with Russian cosmists. They didn't see cosmic order, existing cosmic order, the order of nature, as something that should remain as it is. Because they saw in nature power that kills us. And when we speak about epidemics or pandemics, then we see that suddenly cosmos or a certain order of life crumbles and changes itself under the influence of something that is basically nature, the natural fact that is a virus.
It seems to me that the origin of cosmism, or the situation, the context that in a sense created the urgency for Nikolai Fyodorov to develop his ideas, had very much to do with certain epidemics that occurred in Russia in the 19th century, starvations, droughts, and it's uncanny to find ourselves in a similar sort of condition right now, where basically suddenly a pandemic completely disrupted everything. We're all stuck at home, and the only medicine that has been discovered so far that can actually treat this virus also somehow relates to certain developments in Russian cosmism, namely the experiments that Alexander Bogdanov was doing in 1926 on himself to basically try to, through blood transfusions, through direct blood transfusions between two subjects, to try to transmit antibodies from one person to another in order to cure certain diseases, infectious diseases. So actually, a very close friend of mine, his father was just in a hospital nearby, in the Brooklyn Hospital. He's in his 60s and he got very ill with this virus, almost died. And the treatment that he received at the hospital was a transfusion of plasma with antibodies of people who recovered from COVID. Yeah, he recovered within 5 days. He's now at home in Brooklyn and is doing much, much, much better. So it's very interesting that Bogdanov's insight, that is quite related maybe to the whole trajectory of cosmism, its relationship to medicine, its commitment to defeat death and cure diseases by all means possible, somehow also plays out in this current situation 100 years in the future.
Russian cosmism was, of course, Fedorovian kind of Russian cosmism, was to build a new, actually artificial cosmic order, to make people immortal, to reorganize the cosmic life in its entirety. So to substitute the natural cosmos by the artificial cosmos, self-created cosmos. And that is, of course, a very, let's say, non-Greek idea or even anti-Greek idea. It's ideas that belongs to modernity and is, of course, based on the belief in technology and social organization.
Even if we speak about, let's say, Russian avant-garde and the general Russian context, it's very, of course, modern idea, but related not to all types of modernism, I would say. And for me here, there are two important examples of different approaches to nature, to naturality and artificial transformation of it. And one was represented by Jackson Pollock, like one of the main important and bright symbol of US understanding of naturality and art that plays with this or within this naturality. And on the other hand, Kazimir Malevich, who proposed something absolutely opposite. So for modernism, in case of Pollock, this naturality was like the main basement for creative acts, that all art of him was rely on just spontaneous decisions, spontaneous play of forces, play of gravity, etc., etc. And the gravity was one of the main power in the universe that in case of Cosmism was possibly enemy, at least on the very early stages when we all gathered around the Earth's surface. And in case of Malevich, it was almost opposite, because in his vision, the main idea of artists, one of the possible main idea of artists, is achieving this artificial victory over all possible powers that shaped our experience here in our world on the Earth. And his black square within this context could be considered as something opposite, something that absolutely planned and has nothing to do with a chance. Perhaps Russian Cosmism could show us another way of treating the same banality and automatization. Something that could be comparable with a child learning how to speak. Because when we have a child that learns how to speak, we have process of automatization, because he or she should understand, should learn by heart certain number of words, sounds connected with a particular reaction of muscles, etc., etc. And the automatization of linguistic activity in this case would give definitely a strong impression of reality, and some artistic movements wanted to achieve this, and even philosophical movements.
I think they are Christians because they believe in the world. They believe that if I say something that is persuasive and understandable for everybody, everybody will follow. Yeah, something that's happened to Christ.
I totally agree with Boris that Cosmism, especially in the writings of Fedorov and his close disciples, religious Cosmism is Christian, and even puts Christian logic to the limit in terms of being worldly, activist, and being like ready for a religious feat for in order to save humanity. But at the same time, I think it's important to not to forget about the context in which Cosmism appeared, the context of Russian double belief, when there were numerous sects and religious communities which synthesized Russian Orthodoxy with paganism. So for them, there was no contradiction between these two, and sometimes if you read descriptions of the rituals of the daily lives of these sects, you see how Christianity and paganism even strengthened each other. And that is why I think this religious background can be instructive or elucidating on why there is such a spontaneous or anarchist core within the very paradigm of Cosmism, which is about modernity, mobilization, enlightenment, and Christianity. I think somewhere within it, there is a subtle core, a subtle element or grain of imagination, personal freedom, adherence to absolute immanence, and spontaneity. And that's exactly what biocosmists or cosmist anarchists felt very well. That's why they rejected Fedorovian doctrine of the common task, but at the same time continued his ideas in a different direction.
Yeah, but this is like the heretical part of the whole thing. Yeah, because in that sense, you could even talk about Fedorov as a completely heretical thinker. Yeah, because ultimately what he proposes, despite being such a devout, Eastern Orthodox Christian, yeah, he is essentially suggesting that we bypass God as the agent of immortality, as the agent of eternal life, and take the matter into our own hands. I can't imagine a greater heresy within the theology of Christianity. Yeah. So in a sense, all of the later manifestations like biocosmism, that's probably the extension of a certain kind of a heretical religious tradition into the sort of activist ideology, philosophy, theory, whatever it is, practice, let's say.
Speaking about relationship to the early modernism or early avant-garde, what Arseny was speaking about, I would say that it's also something that connected Russian cosmists with the artists of the time. Yeah, people like Khlebnikov, people like Malevich. This kind of belief in the almost archaic powers of the word and of the image. Something that we probably lost nowadays. I don't know, but many of us lost this belief.
I think it may be possible to speak about certain aspects of Cosmism from even more distant perspective. Yeah, and recently I've been researching a little bit the Epic of Gilgamesh, and this takes us back to very, very ancient cultures like Sumerian culture, which maybe is one of the oldest sort of civilizations, on this planet. And of course, like this quest for immortality, which is the center of Cosmism, is already present there at the very beginning of civilization, when the first cities are being invented, but there is something very oblique about Gilgamesh. It's almost like it's hard to understand what is the point of this epic, because he goes on this quest to find immortality, he doesn't find immortality, he finds rejuvenation, and then he loses it in a very stupid way. He just gets distracted, and some snake comes and steals it away. And all of this sort of heroic voyage and all of this suffering and struggling to achieve it disappear, and then he doesn't even kind of comment on he's a little bit upset, but he doesn't seem to be overwhelmed. And then he returns to the city of Uruk and walks on the walls, and then he dies, and the epic ends.
Gilgamesh wants to find something that gives him immortality, yeah. And also Blok and Biele, they want to find, so to say, a right world, a magic world. Khlebnikov wants to do the same, and Malevich wants to find a magic image, yeah, like black square, yes, that transforms the world. But I think that maybe I follow Derrida here. I would strongly differentiate between language and writing, because language is speaking and writing is actually simply work. It is work. It is manual work or other kind of work. In this sense, writing is totally independent from language. We can speak freely, and we can also persuade somebody. Maybe we can also persuade gods to give us immortality, actually through the power of our language, our persuasive language. But it's one thing. The other thing is to find secular technological immortality in writing through the manual work of bringing letters to the stone or to the paper and whatever. Now, I think what is different between Christianity, post-Christianity, is the belief of Christianity and post-Christian philosophy into value and effectiveness of work. What Christianity brought into the world is belief in work. For example, in writing and rewriting the sacral books of Christianity, what people in monasteries did. They didn't speak, but they were writing all the time. Yeah, it was purely exhausting manual work. Yeah.
But of course, it's transformation that they were after. It's transformation through work.
But basically it was work. Yes, it was transformation, but through the work. And then we have printing and all of that. And then we have Zoom and all of that. But it's all technology. And it is technology that gives us the possibility to transmit language to the long distance or to the other generations. But in certain way, this technology does not coincide with language. It is something that is added to it. And if we look at Marxism, which is secularized Christianity, if we look at Fedorov, which is secularized Christianity, it's all, they are based on the belief into work, yeah? Immortality is something that should be made. It's not something that is given to us, yeah? It's not a gift, and it's also not something that is found by us, and can be found by us. It is something that should be created by us ourselves by a systematic application of work. It is what brings together actually Marxism and October Revolution and the ideas of Cosmism. It is belief, post-Christian belief into the power of working and work.
It seems that, at least with the Sumerians, the invention of writing, the invention of cities, all of that is a result of work, in a sense, of agricultural work, and a certain sophistication of social organization to mobilize and organize labor force to create these canals that they needed for irrigation and accomplish certain kind of land projects that are actually quite difficult because they're very labor intensive and vast and all of that. Yeah. So it's actually, it seems that work produced their civilization rather than magic of gods. Yeah. Even though they worshipped gods, but probably there was some reflexivity to understand that all of this work that they're doing, which was probably extremely hard work as well. I mean, digging trenches is like very physical work. Yeah. This is what is reshaping their society and their culture as well.
And if you look at their civilization and Egyptian civilization, it's of course beginning, I agree, that beginning further simply in terms of material transcendence of life, yeah, creation of the pyramids, self-monumentalization, yeah. The self-monumentalization, statues, writing, pyramids, mummies, it's all attempts to create some kind of materialist version of transcendence or materialist version of immortality in a certain way, very much announcing already a Fedorovian project. So not idealistic, yeah, belief in pre-existed soul, but hard work to create afterlife. Yeah, afterlife was already understood as an effect of hard work.
But I would say that even for Muravyov, the main problem was not in art, but in work again. And here I could continue a little bit what Boris was saying, because even again, returning to Plato, he did not write, but he considered himself as a free philosopher because he was a very rich person. And the philosophers that like sophists needed to work and achieve money for their time were not good philosophers for him. So I guess this idea of work is like crucial for Kosmism, and it's like very important definition because even for Kosmists, because if you speak, for instance, about further version of Kosmism, the idea of labor, of work is like quite present there. And if we speak about more mystical oriented philosophers like Solovyov or Berdyaev, for them work was treated in the same way with Plato treated work as something very rooted in inner world, something too materialistic, something that we should overwhelm in the future somehow through mystical leap to eternal life, to with great artistic effort as well, but effort not in terms of work, but effort in I don't know, unmaterial, idealistic world. And this is quite important for me. And again, if we speak about Muravyov, as we know, he used to work within Institute of Labor together with Gastev, and his idea about mastering of time very suits well with ideas of Gastev about analyzing and transforming labor and optimizing labor. But what Muravyov wanted to do, in my opinion, is make kind of ontologization of this optimization of labor, thinking about labor on a very basic level, on the level of matter.
The cosmist world or the cosmist immortality is something which is not to be found, but to be built, to be accessed via labor, and so on. I think it makes sense to explain why it is so, apart from some of cosmists would call themselves materialists. Because what does materialism mean? Materialism or matter can mean many different things. And I think in case of, in respect to cosmos, we shouldn't imagine this matter as something abstract and fetishized. But when they speak of materiality, when we speak of materiality in cosmist imaginary, it's actually about simple material entities, very simple material objects, and from atoms, which are also material objects, to things we use and work with every day. Why? Because material objects, like a hammer, for example, actually represent history. They are certain reservoirs of time.
What Marx ignores is a problem of natural death. And also Marxists did it, for example. Even Foucault in his biopolitical writings thinks that natural death is not a problem. He doesn't want to deal with that. Only violent death is a problem. So in communism, there's no violence and no violent death, but natural death remains on. And in a certain way, Marxism finds nothing bad in that. There's not a feeling that natural death is something bad you can or should fight against or try to overcome that. In this sense, Marxism loses this dream of immortality you were speaking about, the very ancient dream of immortality. And I would say that Fedorov tried to combine certain kind of Marxism or certain kind of socialism with this promise of immortality. And Arseny mentioned Soloviev. Soloviev directly criticized Fedorov. He said that immortality must be miraculous to be really immortality. So what we really want is a wonder. We don't want to work. We want that somebody comes and gives us immortality as miraculous. And this desire of the miraculous is the only real, I would say, counter proposition to Cosmism. Cosmism is a teaching that calls us to deserve our immortality by work. And the counter proposition should be, or was, and is, no, I don't want to deserve anything. I want to get it without deserving it. I don't want to make any effort to achieve something because this effort makes it something worthless.
If we go back far enough to, like, let's say, pre-Socratic philosophers, right, they were kind of materialists as well, or at least they did not, a lot of them did not really feel that there could be a kind of a magical transcendental realm, that all of the matter of the cosmos is material, but which at the same time did not somehow preclude spirituality. It did not preclude certain kind of mysticism, but it was like a kind of a materially based mysticism.
It's important to distinguish different kinds of materialisms. And if someone says that today we live in the intellectual climate with the multitude of materialisms, it's not true, because there are many materialists in the world intellectual history. So there are several traditions, and there is historical materialism. Historical materialism is not materialism. Yes, because what Marx says is what's important is how humans change matter, the material circumstances, material conditions of life and labor in praxis. Yes, technologies are important. Yes, work is important, and they are interrelated in physical, labor. But at the same time, there is this idea of material substance behind. There is no substance. There's just dialectical relationship between human and nature. When human transforms nature in his practice, in his or her work, this practice in return transforms himself. So these are two different perspectives on matter. Both refer to some kind of materialism, but matter means different things. And of course, within Cosmism, I think we can find those who are closer, who can be at least roughly, who can at least roughly be attributed to the first tradition, and who can who belong to the second. Fyodorov, in this sense, as far as I understand Fyodorov and what he writes, he's closer to historical materialism. But as soon as we start, for example, to read him in a biopolitical perspective, or to stress the biopolitical element within Fedorovian heritage, we get closer to the first materialism, to, let's say, materialism of matter versus materialism of history.
The question of state is interesting here because for Greek philosophy, for Plato, the ideal state is an eternal state that is built according to the eternal laws of cosmos. Yeah? So it's interesting that, of course, this eternal laws of cosmos presuppose death, natural death, and immortal souls of the people going to gods, and then from gods back to humans, in a kind of eternal circulation between gods and men. And it is precisely not what our cosmists wanted. You know, I hear from time to time also in the Russian media discussion to the topic how the state should be organized. Should the state be organized at something that is destined for men, for humans, for individual even, or the individual is for the state? So what is primary, what is secondary? In a certain way, the cosmos is a solution of this controversy, because if you look, for example, on biocosmists, immortalists, they started as anarchists, so as enemies of the state, and ended as supporters of the state. But supporters of the state that is actually made for men, but made for men as immortal men. So if you want to achieve the goal of immortality, and the goal of immortality is the goal of immortality for everybody, yeah, then the state will be something that transcends the individual human life. but at the same time is a means of its immortalization.
And as we know, many avant-garde artists, like Italian futurists, for instance, were big fans of war. And this tendency, in my opinion, again, something opposite, something quite natural, something that tries to destroy already existing order of things, but only for achieving this, let's say, freshness. And the price of this freshness is quite high, because we understand that millions of people lost their jobs, billions of people had not pleasant experience of almost home arrested people, and of course, like hundreds of thousands of people just dead because of the situation.
War, which is again very much related both to the discourse on state and to the discourse on totality, especially in the beginning of the 20th century. These ideas of the total war, which are related to the First World War. And sometimes people ask me how I define Kosmism. And I actually use expression which the proponents of the total war used. It's total mobilization. But I think it's very important that Russian cosmists tried to invert this total mobilization discourse even before it was there, demilitarize it. So I usually define Kosmism as total mobilization of techniques for the sake of rejuvenation of tradition. And I think here all the key terms of modernity and reaction to modernity are intertwined. But it's again crucial to underline fundamental anti-militarism of Fedorov and other Kosmists, in contrast to the Italian futurists, which Arsenio mentioned. So yes, they wanted total mobilization, but total mobilization of techniques and science for the sake of people, not vice versa, not total mobilization of people for the sake of the victory in the imperial war.
When we speak about idealism and materialism, we speak about a project, a thinking about the future, not about the past, not about the present, because the present can be also described monistically, but about the future, the plan, project, and the way to realize it. So the way to realize it through gift, like Heidegger says, somebody gives us the future, and we should be thankful for this gift, or we try to create the future, to make the future. What communism was an attempt to do in Kosmism too. So I think we should, when we speak about these different attitudes and approaches, we always speak not about past and present, we speak about future, how the future should look like, how we manage the future, how we plan the future, how we project the future, how we make the future.
This kind of projective thinking, this is exactly what enables us to oppose Kosmism to religious Silver Age strands, both in thinking and in culture, such as Solovyov, who was already mentioned. Because Fedorov, as well as many others, tended to think in terms of causes and effects. So in order to get something tomorrow, You have to start working today. There is a very, let's say, crude logic of modern causality in his thinking. The only thing is that he tries to turn it into, to build a certain religious ethics upon this causal logic. And this religious ethics is supposed to sort of balance the instrumental reason. And this thinking in terms of causes and effects is another thing which opposes, which enables us to contrast Fedorov and others to Western Christianity and Solovyov and their idea of miracle, because miracle is what is done at the moment, is what is given at the moment, and the very idea, the very possibility of miracle is based on certain absolute contingency of being. For Fedorov and others and other cosmists, it wasn't so. For them, there was no this fundamental contingency in being, which is bigger than the human effort.
Yes, absolutely, I absolutely agree. And I would say that today we believe that contingency is decisive. We actually believe only in contingency. And that is why we don't want to make future, we want to avoid future. We see the future as unpleasant miracle, as an unpleasant contingency. How we imagine future? Environment catastrophe, a new virus will come that kills us, asteroid will come that kills us, maybe some extraterrestrial will come and kill us, maybe some other unpleasant event will kill us. Yeah. So our vision is apocalyptic. It's like Solovyov also. The vision was apocalyptic. What actually people wanted, like him, is to avoid, miraculously avoid the future. Russian cosmism is based on a strange optimism, very un-Western optimism. Optimism is not that moral or whatever, but I would say ontological optimism. So that we have long period of time for our work. Yeah, not only 8 hours every day, but maybe thousands years to build our immortality. It's very un-Western. Western thinking and Western Catholic thinking is much more skeptical in relationship to what comes in the future.
Yeah, somehow optimism always, at least in the West, comes across as naivete. Yeah, that only stupid people would be optimistic because look at history, it's all tragedy and disaster. Yeah, so I think this is also one of the reasons why a lot of people just dismiss cosmism like off the bat. It's precisely the optimism that makes it appear as less serious.
There are several lines of critique towards optimism. So first line is what you, Anton, mentioned, is that optimism is naive, and in order to be serious, to provide a serious evaluation of what's going on, we need to be at least skeptical. At the same time, there is a second line of criticism, which is probably minor, but it's still there, that optimism is a form of ideology and the product of progress. Optimism is a very bourgeois kind of attitude, which emerged when the bourgeois tried to reason their success and tried to reason to evaluate the products of their labor. So the very idea of progress, which is bourgeois in itself, is optimistic that tomorrow people will live better than today, if they work enough, of course. But at the same time, even with this kind of approach, tomorrow comes and some live better while some live worse. If we go back to Cosmism and Cosmist attitudes, let's say, they exhibited very particular kind of optimism, both non-bourgeois, even though related to the idea of progress, and critical, because if you open further for other Cosmism, these pages are full of critique towards Western Christianity, towards Kant, towards Nietzsche, towards Western and Western civilization or Russian culture. They are full of critique.
Well, actually, if we speak about optimism and pessimism, the idea of contingency and instability, ontological instability of human existence, comes with the death of God, of course, because God was an ontological guarantee of human existence, of human history. So if there is no God, then our existence and our future has no guarantee, no ontological guarantee. I think the interesting answer to that was given by Malevich, and then actually in a different form by Derrida. Malevich says, namely, that because God is dead, the disappearance of the world as we know it is impossible. Because if we believe that God is there, then God created the world out of nothingness and has an ability to destroy the world and come back to the nothingness. But if God doesn't exist and we are materialists, and if we are materialists, we believe in the fact that matter cannot be destroyed. Yeah? Only God can destroy matter. But if God doesn't exist, matter is indestructible. And because matter is indestructible, also the world is indestructible. It can be damaged, but it cannot be destroyed. In ironic way, Derrida spoke in almost the same terms about nuclear war. He said, I don't believe in the destructive power of nuclear war because it will be really destructive if all the orders and system will really work. But I'm sure that the orders and system will not work. At the end, the world will be damaged but not destroyed.